that to stay connected to us. Tonight's presentation is being hosted by the Yavapai County Master Gardeners. We are part of the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. Every county in Arizona has a cooperative extension office. You may actually be familiar with some of the other programs that we are involved with, such as 4-H, food safety, nutrition education, STEM and commercial horticulture, and small acreage support. Master Gardeners provide science-based horticultural information in their presentations. Tonight, Tricia Michelson will be presenting on vermicomposting, the wonderful world of worms. Tricia is a die-hard veggie gardener and certified as a master gardener in 2013. Believing that gardening is a continual experiment, Tricia takes on new gardening challenges each year. Vermicomposting was one of these challenges and has turned into a permanent part of her growing processes. She grows vegetables inside her home as well as outside and loves sharing the joy of gardening through public speaking engagements throughout the county. Tricia, with that, take it away.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm really happy to be here tonight. This is a presentation I've wanted to do for a long time, and I've learned so much about worms. I just want to share it with you all. So let's get started. The first thing we have to understand is there's a difference between vermiculture and vermicomposting. Vermiculture is actually the culture of earthworms. The goal is to continually increase your number of worms so you can get a sustainable harvest. And in the research I've done, a lot of people give their worms away because you seem to produce so many, and they end up with not enough for what they wanted. So that's something to be thinking about as you're growing your worms or actually performing vermiculture. Now, vermicomposting is the process by which the worms are used to convert the organic material into a humus-like material known as vermicompost. Looks very, very, very similar to dirt, very rich, you just know it's organic. So that's our start. Now, the value of vermiculture is that our earthworms provide a natural method for recycling organic material. It's wonderful. You can get rid of food scraps. You can get rid of paper, lots of paper, including cardboard for all of us Amazon shoppers. Your garden remains. So when you're tearing your garden apart at the end of the year, all of those can actually over time be eaten by your worms. And your yard trimmings, your grass clippings, all the leaves that are falling today, all those are fair items for your earthworms to recycle for you. Now, earthworm castings are an eco-friendly fertilizer. They're actually awesome because you don't have to buy fertilizer if you use your castings. They stimulate the natural activity of beneficial soil microorganisms. They promote the activity of enzymes and natural plant growth regulators, and we're going to see a cool example of that. And they regulate the availability of essential plant nutrients. So basically, they do everything you want in a fertilizer, and they cost you nothing while getting rid of organic waste material. How perfect is that? Now, the University of Georgia, the Engineering Outreach Program, did a study, and they took 3 different types of medium. They took a potting mix, they took red soil, which is just basically dirt from the ground, and worm castings. And you can visually see the result here. Plants that were grown in worm castings grew 3 times faster than identical plants in identical environment grown in potting mix. That is just incredible to me to look at that and see the visual difference. But if you like that, look at this. These are turnips. Now, this was done as part of a project at the North Carolina State Extension, which, by the way, I have their webpage URL at the very end of this presentation. They have a phenomenal webpage for vermicomposting. They put on an annual conference for vermiculture. They're really very into the vermiculture world. But look at these turnips. The small one had no vermicompost at all. The medium one had 10% volume. So it was 90% soil, 10% castings. But the large turnip, that additional 10%, so up to 20%, gave you that ginormous turnip. And I can guarantee you it probably tasted just as good as it is large. So those are good visual representations of what compost, the vermicompost, can do in your yard. Now, we need to understand a little bit about earthworms. Are they all created equal? There's actually over 9,000 different species of earthworms, and they're divided into 3 categories, one of them being identified as epigeic. And the epigeic worms are the only ones that have been identified as suitable for vermiculture. There's 7 different earthworm species within that epigeic. 3 of them are tropical, and so we would never see them here, and 4 are what's called temperate. The way you can identify an epigeic earthworm is they live in the topsoil. They deposit their castings on the surface. They're not depositing down in the soil. But most importantly, especially for up here, is they don't burrow deep in the ground. So you can have your typical earthworm in your yard, but those are not going to be the same as an epigeic worm that's suitable for vermiculture. Now, the one that we commonly use is known as Eisenia fetida, also known as the red K wiggler or red wiggler. They're also known as redworms. Now, the name fetida means foul smelling. And the reason for they're named that is they have a protective mechanism of if you were to pick one of these up and irritate it in your hand, he's going to put off a yellow foul smelling mucus. And so it's his protection mechanism. And that's where the name came from. So the worm that you would be looking for would be this red wiggler worm if you're going to do vermicomposting. And you can find them in a lot of places. Now, worms need to be in a certain environment. They need a moisture content that's 60 to 85% wet. You always hear soil that when you wring it out, it doesn't drip. And that's true with worms. About 80% moisture content is perfect. They breathe through their skin, and so they need that moisture content. They need it aerated as well. Now, the ideal temperature is about 70 degrees, but they can tolerate a range of about 40 to 90. I've had worms outside on my patio. I typically bring my box into the garage during the winter. This year, I have worms that I've emptied my castings into my compost pile, and they very happily lived all summer. So it's going to be interesting next spring to see if I have worms that have been able to survive in a pretty deep compost pile. But keep in mind, they don't go deep. So it's going to be interesting. That'll be one of my experiments. Now, the other thing about an environment for your worms is you need to maintain a pH of about 7. And we're going to talk about some of the things that happen when you don't maintain a good pH in your worm bin. Now, worm bedding, if you look out on the web, everybody says use paper. And paper has a lot of problems. It's really good for them to eat. You don't want shiny paper. You don't want anything with a coating on it. Color is okay, but you don't want the shiny type paper. Cardboard is phenomenal. Coir, which is the outside of a coating of a coconut, is wonderful. I'm going to talk more about my favorite compost bedding, worm bedding shortly. Wood shavings will work. Dry dead leaves will work. You can use hay or straw. There's also commercial bedding. I don't see any reason a human needs to buy commercial bedding for their worms, but it does exist. But you have to remember, you've got to keep this moist. And that's why paper is so hard, because if you think about paper, it tends to stick together when you get it wet. And you need to have air movement. It can't be sloppy wet. And paper dries out really fast. Wood shavings, they're very hard to get moist. You know, dead leaves, you're only going to get them so moist. So you have to think about this balance of keeping it, 80% moist. You also have to be able to aerate it. And up to 50% of this bedding is actually going to be used as their food. So it gets a little complicated. Now, here's my favorite bedding. On the left, you see a brick of coir, and it's currently wrapped in a piece of plastic. All you do is you rip the plastic off, you put it in a pail, you fill the pail up with water, and that thing is going to explode over the next hour or so into a very loose product. I don't know, medium, whatever you want to call it. So you see on the right, after I've exploded it, what it will look like. Now I take and add to that shredded paper. So this is a bin that's ready for me to get it wet. I have it sitting ready. So all I have to do is add water and get it to that right moisture content and sprinkle it over the top of my worm bin. If I don't use it all, that's okay. It can just sit in the bin. It'll dry out. I can rehydrate it again. The worms will very quickly eat the shredded paper. And it's kind of funny because it just seems to, all the paper seems to just disappear. My very first worm bin was probably, I got it about maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I tried just shredded paper. And that was a learning lesson because I found it really was hard to keep it wet. Now, what worms eat? Oh my goodness. They're voracious little creatures. And so you can feed them vegetables, fruit, coffee grounds, tea, including the tea bag. You want to take the little staple out, but they can eat bread. They can eat, we've talked already, leaves and yard waste. Eggshells are excellent to help the pH. Paper and pasta, you can give them crackers. They'll eat just about anything. Here's an example of food that I fed my worms the other night. In that, there's a banana peel, there's some eggshells, there was some coleslaw that didn't look so good. It didn't have any salad dressing on it. It was just the shredded coleslaw, and some kale leaves from my kale plant outside that weren't looking too great. So I just clipped them off and put them in there. And the bottom, you notice I say, what's missing? Well, this is all what you would call in the compost world, green material. And vermicomposting is much like your normal composting. You have to have your greens and your browns. So what's missing is the papers, the leaves, the coconut coir. All those things are missing. But I do those in 2 separate parts. Now, I've seen others, people that here locally, that mix it all together. I just happen to do it separately. There's good and bad to doing that. Now, the things you don't want to feed them ever. You don't want to feed meat. You don't want to feed dairy. There's an exception, and I'll mention that in a minute. Citrus, the only citrus you should ever feed is really old moldy rinds. And that should be minimum. Sauces, oils, foods with preservatives, spicy foods, and absolutely not pet waste. I specify dog and cat because here in Yavapai County, we have a lot of people who have chickens as pets, and we have guinea pigs and rabbits, and their wastes are okay if they have been aged properly, because chicken waste is quite hot and you don't want to be putting that much heat into your worm bin. The only time you're going to use dairy is if you soak bread in milk and use it to pull some things out of your compost pile, which we'll talk about. So when you make this food, you want to grind it up. Smaller is better. It's okay to freeze things like worms love melons. They love melons and squashes and things like that. So I will actually freeze cantaloupe rinds, and they get nice and mushy that way when I defrost them. And I don't have to grind them up. But keep in mind, if you leave a banana peel sitting, there's banana peel that's easily shredded up. I just use a little Cuisinart that sits on my countertop. And as I'm cooking or preparing food, I'm just dropping things into that Cuisinart, and that is setting me up for my next feeding for my worms. We're going to go on to an exciting, I saw this slide defined online as worm sex, and I thought, I don't think I really want to go there. We're going to call it Takes Two. Now, worms have both male and female characteristics in one worm, but it takes 2 of them to actually produce offspring that are hardy and can live. So what they do is they line up their bands, and in this photo you can see it circled. There's an actual ring set on top of this worm's band, and they'll line those 2 bands up, and they'll release a mucus that will completely surround the 2 worms. They will hang out there for a couple hours. They wiggle out, and it creates what's left over in this band of mucus that they've left behind is a little cocoon. Now the cocoon dries out and forms a hard shell that's going to protect the eggs as they develop. Now this little thing is going to be about the size of a grain of rice. It starts out white, then it turns yellow, and then it turns brown. And when it turns kind of a reddish color, the worms are ready to hatch. Now, it can take anywhere from 3 weeks to a year. And your worms are typically going to hatch in warmer weather. So I was looking in my bin the other day, and I saw several worms doing their thing. And I thought, yep, I'm not going to have babies out of that until sometime in the spring, because it's just cold right now. I'm not bringing them in the house, so they're staying in the garage. Now this cocoon will have as many as 10 eggs, but only 2 to 6 worms will emerge. Now they will grow, and in 2 to 3 months, they're ready to start producing. So it's not unusual to look in your worm bin and see lots of worms with bands on them. I would be concerned if I looked in and didn't see any with bands on them. Now, the first time I saw this, this is a picture of the lid of my worm bin. The first time I saw it, I was so excited. I told friends, I've got baby worms. Well, guess what? These are not baby worms. These are actually potworms, and they're indicative of potential problems in your worm box. So if you see these, you know you might have some problems you need to look into. They almost always will appear when you have gushy fruit in there, like peaches or nectarines or melons. That's when I seem to notice them the most. So what these potworms indicate is you've got too much acid, your pH isn't right, it's too wet, you're overfeeding them, and typically that overfeeding is going to be your vegetables, or you've got too much starch in there. So what you can do is you can add cardboard, paper, something to soak up, the moisture. Cut back, as I said, on the fruit and vegetables for sure. Remove any fermenting excess food. There are some things that you'll put in, maybe banana peels. I don't always chop them up. Definitely the rinds on the melons. There are times you don't chop things up. And if they're not disintegrating, if they're not disappearing, you want to get rid of those out of your worm bin. You want to aerate the soil, and that's going to loosen it up. It's going to dry it out a bit. And this is the time you especially want to add crushed eggshells. You might want to check your egg bin and see if you've got some extra eggs in there you can get rid of, because eggshells will definitely help with that acidity. But don't be delighted like I was and think you've got a lot of baby worms, because that's not what those are. Now, worm habitats come in a number of different shapes and sizes and all sorts of things. You can have your do-it-yourself worm boxes. My very first one was a do-it-yourself, and I made it small because I wasn't really sure I wanted to engage in this project for very long, but you can make them big too. You can purchase worm boxes. Now, my second worm box, the one I'm using right now, I didn't buy. It was donated to me, but it was a purchased worm box, and it actually a number of boxes together. I like all the functions and features I've got in it. So I'm very pro that. I'm going to show you though how you can make a good worm box. And then worm towers. Those are a little bit different, and we'll talk about those as well. So here is a classic example of a worm box that somebody built themselves. You've got multiple layers. You've got a lid. The plastic is dark. Worms do not like light, and so you don't want clear plastic worm boxes. That would just drive your worms insane. They would be trying to get out. But this is a really good methodology to do your own. So it takes 3 to 4 plastic tubs, or you can use 5-gallon buckets. You could use a tub as big as this, or you could use the shoebox size. You could do the same thing with the smaller shoeboxes. And then 4 small plastic containers, like yogurt containers, little yogurt containers. And I'll show you what those are for in a second. So the first thing you'd want to do is you'd want to take and drill holes, and the holes have to be big enough for the worms to get through. So at least 1/4 inch. And you want a lot of holes in the bottom because your worms are going to traverse through this. And in the bottom tub or bucket, you're not going to drill holes, but this is where your yogurt cartons are going to go. They're going to go upside down, and they're going to provide a base for the first tub to sit on, because there's something that gets created in the worm world called leachate. Some people call it worm pee. And you need a place for that leachate to settle in. Now, this person, when they made this worm bin, did not add one thing that I would strongly recommend, which would be a spigot. And that would be at the very bottom on either end, drill a hole and literally put like a faucet into that so that you can release the liquid. Otherwise, you're going to be lifting your worm bin with all your castings off of this and having to sit it aside to be able to empty this, because trust me, in a good worm box, you don't have a lot of leachate, but you will be producing a fair amount. Now, this one, I had to add this picture because this is what you call a disaster waiting to happen. They've only used 2 bins, which is fine, but they've taken the cups and the little containers and put them on the bottom. They've put holes in the bottom of that bottom container, which I've said not to do, and all their leachate is going to go into the lid. Now, that's going to fill up really fast and it's going to make a mess every time they want to empty or get rid of the leachate. It's just not a good design. So there's a lot of places on the web you can find that describe how to do it. Let me just tell you, this is not a good way to do it. A lot of them will say drill those air holes around the top because you do have to have air going in. You'll notice that in the ones that you purchase, they don't have air holes. It's kind of interesting. So here's what purchased worm boxes look like. My worm box is the orange one on the left. It has its spigot in the front, so it's very easy to open and close and get the worm leachate out. The one on the right, it also has a spigot, but it's underneath. I would think that would be inconvenient, but what can I say? And the one below, it just has a tray, which again, I don't think that's going to be very good. Your price for these are going to run anywhere from about $129 to upside of $200. And so you might want to test out a homemade one. If you're not really sure you want to be a vermicomposter, you may want to try it out with a DIY first, because it is a rather pricey hobby, but the results are so worth it. Now, this is a worm tower, and I've described them for years in my gardening classes, and I've never actually built one. This is a PVC pipe in the center, and it's got holes drilled in it. So the liquid can leach out. The worms hypothetically live in there. Let me tell you, they're going to go out. What brings them back is putting the vegetable scraps on the top. That's where you would feed them, is on the top of that tower. The flower pot over the top is to keep the rain from going in. Even though it's got a small hole on the top, it's not going to cause problems, but it will keep the sunlight out, and it will also keep the rain out. And the worms will traverse back and forth, and their castings will be out there naturally in your garden, and the leachate will also be out there naturally in the garden. I've always wanted to do it, and I've just never built them. So I've seen lots of examples online that people are very successful with these. I question our winter and how your worms would do in the winter in these. So that would be something that you'd have to investigate. Finally, the byproducts of our worms. So the very most important byproduct is our castings. And our castings are, dare I say, poop. They're the product that the worm puts out from what they ate. Now you also have the worm bin leachate, that liquid that sinks to the bottom and goes through, and it's part of what keeps the moisture in your worm bin. If it's not properly leaching out, you're going to end up with an overly wet worm bin that you don't want. So you want that to be going out. And another byproduct is worm tea. It's very similar to compost tea, but it's made with your worm's castings. And I'm going to give you a recipe on how you actually do it. So the first thing you have to do is to figure out how to separate your worms from the castings. Now, the typical method that I first learned was the tarp method. You empty your castings onto a tarp, you make a pile of the castings, and you keep scraping them out to the side. Your worms are going to go to the middle because they don't want to be in the light. And you'll end up with a pile of worms under a bunch of castings, but all the rest of the castings all around can be scooped up and used. It's a dirty mess when you do it that way. So while that was the first way I learned, it probably wasn't the way I was going to do it in the future. The horizontal method is really common. You take and you start feeding only on one side of your top worm bin. And the worms will just naturally migrate to that. They'll migrate over to that side very quickly, leaving the other side for you to be able to harvest your castings. Now, this is presuming you're using a one bin system. If you think back, I'm going to switch back here really quick. Not the disaster, this one, you see that you've got multiple layers. And in multiple layers, you're going to be able to just literally lift out one of those layers instead. So the systems I'm talking about here are for single bin. The other method, and I've used this one and like it as well, is you lay down the gardener cloth with the holes in it, and you put some bedding on top, you put some food on top. Worms are going to come up to eat, especially if you put something they like potatoes or cantaloupe. They're going to come up. You can lift that screen off, and then you can harvest underneath. And that was after trying the tarp method, the vertical method was the one that I preferred, but horizontal or vertical methods both work really well for separating them. And then keep in mind, if you're doing a multi-layer bucket or tub system, all you have to do is take that top tub off, which is predominantly where your worms are going to be, and set it aside while you get the others. Now, you might find, I found it, that you have worms in those layers below. You can take some extra time and feed to the top and just move them into your top bin. Or if you're going to be putting them into a compost pile, you can go ahead and turn them into your compost pile, because they're going to continue to work. If you've got a good active compost pile, they're going to continue to work there as well. Now you can take the worm castings and use them as a soil additive. You can use them as a soilless mix, or you can use them as a tea or slurry. As an additive, they're really simple. You don't have to measure. You know, if you're putting in new plants, you can just throw a handful in a planting hole. I was planting garlic the other day, and all I was doing, it was a couple of weeks ago now, all I was doing was just, you know, had a bucket of my worm compost next to me, and I was just tossing it in as I was putting in my garlic, and my garlic's already up. When you're propagating seeds, you can use it as a seed mix. You can do it with the coir, 2 parts coir to 1 part worm casting. You can use it as a general soil conditioner, just digging it through your soil. Before you mulch, you can lay down a thin layer of your worms castings and then mulch over the top. You're going to be fertilizing your soil. And you can even use them in container pots that you have plants in already. So you want to figure for about 75% of your potting soil, you want to exchange it with 25% of your worm castings. If you're starting new plants, it's usually cup for cup, 1 cup of potting soil to 1 cup of castings. It's just going to invigorate the growth of those plants. Now, if you want to make a soilless mix, something that's really light, we have lots of decks up here, and people like to grow things on their decks, but they don't like the heavy soil. So this would be an ideal way to use worm castings and get beautiful plants. You could take 40% castings, 30% perlite, and 30% vermiculite. If you've ever worked with vermiculite and perlite, you know they're very light. They have no weight at all. And while your castings are heavier, you're less than 50% in weight. So you're going to have a delightful light soil that you can use as a soilless mix. Now, worm tea, haven't ever done this. I think I'm going to have to try it. It's a natural fertilizer. It's made from worm castings, water, and sugar. Sugar is to develop the microbes. So to make the tea, you're going to dechlorinate 10 gallons of water, and 10 gallons is a subjective number. But this is the formula that I found that I really seem to resonate with online. Dechlorinating water, for anyone who hasn't done that, simply means put it in a bucket and let it sit outside for 24 hours. That way, all the chlorine is going to dissipate into the air. You're going to take about 1 pound of worm castings and put it in something that's mesh, a bag. Pantyhose is perfect. You could use cheesecloth if you tie it up, but something that's a mesh. You're going to take that castings and into a 5-gallon bucket, you're going to put the castings in, and you're going to cover it with half the water. You're going to add a tablespoon of molasses or honey or some other type of sugar. And then the kicker is to sink an aquarium bubbler in the water and let it run for 24 to 48 hours. I've seen some people that would say they do it as little as 12. I would err on the side of aerating it more. That's going to allow the microbe development to occur. It's going to allow a good immersion of all of the goodness in the castings throughout the water. Then you're going to remove the bubbler and the castings. You're going to mix the remaining waters and use right away. It's not something you want to sit. If it's something that you're going to have sitting, you're going to have to go back and aerate it again. But 10 gallons, if you're watering and fertilizing a big garden, is going to go really fast anyway. So, but you can adjust. You could go down and use 5 gallons. You could use 2 gallons, whatever. But that's your basic formula for making worm tea. Now, worm bin leachate, the worm pea, needs to have a little discussion. I was so excited because my worms were just producing leachate like crazy, and I was all over it as fertilizer, and I used it as fertilizer this year a lot, and it was good, and I think in some ways I was just lucky. I've said it's the liquid that drains out of the worm bin. what you have to realize is it may carry a bad mixture of microorganisms in it. It's that liquid that's sinking through all that rotting and decaying stuff that you might have in those layers. So who knows what you're picking up? It's really going to depend on what you've put into your compost pile. So you might get some things that you really didn't want. It does need to be diluted. 1 part leachate to 10 parts water. And you only want to use fresh leachate. You don't want to store it, which has been the problem I've been, because I've actually stored a lot. So I'm dumping a lot of leachate. I will continue to use it. I'll continue to use it as fresh. But it might even be better if you were to aerate that, if you plan on using it regularly. To aerate, it's just a simple little aquarium pump. So pretty easy. You can even hook it up just to a 9-volt battery. Pretty easy to do. But worm bin leachate is different than compost tea. You do need to understand that. So in closing on this, what I want you to think about with worms is you want to practice benign neglect. When has anybody ever told you to neglect something? Worms aren't something that you have to stress over or be frustrated about. Worms are going to eat about half their weight a day. So you have to feed them pretty regularly. But if there's food in the bin, I fed that plate that I showed you 2 days ago. They're still not done with it. So you can be a little neglectful. You can go on vacation for a week and they'll still be alive. They won't be happy, they'll be alive. But you don't want to overfeed them. You want to neglect them a little. You do want to remember to keep adding bedding. That's a hard one for me because my bedding is my browns. So you need to keep adding that bedding. You need to keep it moist. That's one place you don't want to neglect them. You want to make sure that they've got adequate, but not too much moisture. And really, folks, don't freeze your worms. You'll be so sad because they will freeze in a worm bin sitting outside on your patio. There's just not enough mass to protect them. So take them someplace warm. In a shed is fine up here. I know people have them in their sheds. In your garage is fine. Worm bins that are managed right don't smell, so you don't have a negative scent there. And it's very important. Be sensitive to big changes in your worm box. I saw liquid coming out all levels one time, and I'm like, what the heck? And I didn't realize they were creating as much leachate as they were. I was drowning the poor guys. So that was a big change I had to be very aware of, and I fixed it really quickly, and they lived. If they're trying to escape, that's a change you don't want to see. There's something wrong. Probably your pH is off if they're trying to escape. Or they're starving, one of the two, or it's too wet. But big changes are the things that you're typically going to be looking for in your worm box. With that, here are 3 great resources. And this will be a slide that will be in the deck that you will be able to see online. The North Carolina State Extension is probably the best extension site that I found, and I looked at tons of them. The Worm Tower, if you're interested in that, you can get more specific directions at the permaculturenews.org, and good directions for making compost tea can be found at redwormcomposting.com. So with that, Lauren.
Okay, Tricia, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. I had a quick question. So I do cold composting in 2 rotating bins, and I find if I put a couple worms in my bins when I start my composting, I have a lot of worms when it's dirt. Is
Mhm.
that, it just sounds like a lot of what we're doing is just general composting. Is that true?
The worms enhance your existing compost. They're
Okay.
going to break the material down faster and better. And they're at the same time, while they're helping break down your material in your compost pile, they're going to be putting out castings. And so they're adding back while they're helping compost. What you have to be careful about in a compost pile is if you've got it too hot, you'll cook the worms.
Yep.
So you want a cool compost pile,
Right.
to have them in.
Bill wanted to know, where is the best place to acquire the correct earthworms?
You know, you can find them anywhere. And I literally say anywhere. I found them on petco.com. They should run somewhere about $25 to $40. Of course, you can buy them at Amazon. All you have to do is Google worms. I know we've had a lot of calls to the extension on where can you buy them local. And I honestly don't have an answer for that, but I have to believe they are sold local as well.
Okay.
So one thing I didn't say, you're going to want a pound of worms.
Okay.
That's the standard, about the right size. A pound of worms is going to have about 1,000 worms in it. If you've got normal worms, if you've got really mature worms, you're going to have about 500 in a pound. And if you've got younger worms, you could have as many as 2,000 in a pound.
Okay. You also mentioned, Venus wanted to know, you mentioned composting Amazon boxes. Can this be used as worm bedding? If so, what needs to be done to prepare for that?
All you have to do to take your Amazon boxes is to shred them, cut those boxes up into small pieces. The parts that have tape on them, you want to remove the tape completely. It would be better not to use it if it's got packaging labels on it, but all that cardboard is really good. Something else I find I use a lot is, in the spring, I will use those the cups that compost. I don't like the seed cups that compost being in my soil because I find they don't compost well. So I always rip them off, and I just tear those into pieces and throw them into the compost, or into the vermicompost pile as well.
Okay. And Bill wants to know, what about horse manure?
Horse manure is fine if it's been aged. Keep in mind, that's something else that's really hot, as is cow manure. So you just want it really well aged before you put it in.
Okay. Paula wants to know, what's your favorite coir supplier?
You know, when I got my box, I was given 2 big cases of coir, and it goes a really long way. I would just look online and shop for it, just price it.
Okay. Bill has a lot of questions. So he also wants to know, he heard that worms can detoxify the things they eat, so that the castings are not toxic despite what they may eat.
You know, that's a really good point, Bill. There was an individual who did a study. It wasn't a scientific study, but they put some worms onto a plate that had E. coli. It tested for E. coli, and it had food that had E. coli. And the worms completely digested the food, and in less than an hour had completely detoxified that E. coli.
Wow.
So yes, and when you think of all the rotting stuff that you're putting in, you know, you're especially like with eggshells, you know, you're putting potentially E. coli into your worm bin.
Yep. Bill also said this might be the best presentation on vermiculture that he's ever seen, and he's seen a few.
Thank you, sir.
And then he said that he uses only, he used only the use of leachate on his ornamentals, not food crops.
And that is one strong recommendation from a lot of people. I would not use it on the leaves of lettuce. I would, I never spray onto my plants, so I always fertilize at the base. That's just me. So I would agree with him. It's excellent for ornamentals. It can be used on vegetables, but again, I would aerate it, and I would lean to going to the compost tea instead of the leachate.
Okay. Corey posted that MDI Rock in Prescott has coir blocks.
Oh, good to know.
Thank you, Corey.
Thanks, Corey.
Diane says, I have a continuous worm bin at my home in my basement. I think it runs a little drier than these systems as there is no leachate. So, but I just empty it out from the bottom, worms stay on the top with the food, into a sifter that that Stevie made, and for it to sift out. It's beautiful stuff, makes things grow twice as much. She says,
Well,
do you have
then she's
experience
got a
with
very good worm bin, because technically a perfect worm bin will not have leachate.
Okay, and she says, do you have experience with these continuous bins?
I don't know what the term continuous bin means, because as far as I'm concerned, they're continuous.
Diane, can you expand on that question? Go ahead and unmute if you want to.
Sure. Yeah, the continuous is, you don't have to dump out the whole containers to go through it, because you just, you can empty it out from the bottom, and then you just continue to put the food and the paper scraps on top or cardboard on top. And so you're never having to like dump it out or do it that way. It just stays like you keep emptying out from the bottom.
I take the bottom bin out, and that's what I dump. And so my worms are on the top.
Okay, yeah.
So we might be talking something similar. I've got four levels to mine.
Okay.
That's all the questions that I have.
Well, thank you, guys.
And you have a lot of kudos and thank yous for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
This will be posted in about 2 days on our website, which I have posted how to access it along with the PowerPoint presentation. We thank everybody for joining us tonight. And Tricia, thank you so much. This was so educational. I really appreciated it.
Well, I actually learned some things about my worms, and I'm going to be putting in a second worm. I call them worm towers. They're not the same, but I'm going to be putting in a second set this next year. So I want to increase the amount of goodness I can put in my garden.
Okay. And with that, we look forward to seeing you all sometime at the end of January. We will probably at the beginning of January start sending out information for our next set of presentations. You can always look at the U of A website to get more information on that. And with that, I want to say good night, and our team, please stay on and we'll do a debrief after this, and have a happy holiday, everybody.
And if anybody has suggestions for things they'd like to hear about next year, send it into the Master Gardener Help Desk. They will get it to us, or to the Speakers Bureau, either one. And we'll see if we can't get those topics covered for you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye.